Hello, everyone. So welcome to today's webinar on the role of religion and spirituality in recovery from serious mental illnesses. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeastern Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or Mhttc, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions and the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation. My name is Cathy Rivera, and I'm the project coordinator of this center and will be facilitating the webinar today. The Mhttc is funded by Samsa, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supportive practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the Mhttc Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeastern Caribbean Mhttc is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link that will be provided on the screen, or I will include it in a chat box. Following the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint slides in the next couple of days. Also, we encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer these questions. This presentation was prepared for the Mhttc Network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, or Samsa. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyright sources, is in public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from Samsa or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. At the time of this presentation, Eleanor F. McCann-Katz is serving as Samsa Assistant Secretary. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS, SAMHSA, or the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Now let's begin our webinar. We have two presenters with us today. We have Dr. Ann Murphy, who is an associate professor and co-director of the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions at Rutgers School of Health Professions. Dr. Murphy conducts research focused on interventions to improve the lives of people with mental illnesses and previously provided psychiatric rehabilitation services. She also teaches within the Master's in Science in Rehabilitation Counseling and PhD in Psychiatric Rehabilitation Program at Rutgers. As co-director of the Mhttc, a federally funded center, Dr. Murphy works to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health workforce to provide evidence-based mental health interventions. Dr. Murphy's work is informed by her lived experience in recovery from mental illness. We also have Dr. Mark Salzer, who is a psychologist and professor of social and behavioral sciences in the College of Public Health at Temple University. He is also the principal investigator and director of the Temple University Collaborative on Community Inclusion of Individuals with Psychiatric Disabilities, a rehabilitation research and training center that has been funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research since 2003. So we welcome you, and I'm going to hand it over to our presenters.
I have to remember to unmute myself. Thank you, Cathy, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We're really happy to have you, and we're happy to be able to present on this topic and have a discussion around this important topic. I wanted to start by asking a quick question just to get a sense of who is with us today. So a poll should have popped up on your screen. So if you can just quickly indicate your professional role. This doesn't encapsulate everybody, but it does give us a general sense of who's with us. So I'm just going to wait 30 seconds or so for people to be able to vote. Okay, so it's looking so far like, here we go. I'll share it with everybody so everybody can see. We have about 30, around a third mental health clinicians, a little under a third peer supporters, that's great. About 14% addictions, 7% clergy, 20% other, and one psychiatrist with us. So welcome to everybody, and I see some people typing in the chat box some of the options that I didn't list. So thank you for your understanding there. So that's great. That just gives us a little bit of a sense. So I wanted to start today just with this quote that I found in an article written by someone who's relied on his spirituality and faith as he's lived with his mental health condition. It says, after living with a psychiatric illness for the last 17 years, I feel that I now know who I am, where I'm going, and who I've become. During this long journey, spirituality has given me the resilience and the capacity to bear and live with personal pain, to accept difficulties, and to find meaning in my experiences. Prayer has led me to this acceptance in my life, and there is not a day that goes by without prayer and a strong spiritual connection with God. This isn't everyone's experience, but I did want to just start us off by highlighting some of the ways that religion and spirituality can serve as a support to those who are experiencing psychiatric conditions. And I thought it was a good place to start as we talk about the role of religion and spirituality in recovery from mental illnesses. So it's likely not news to folks on this call that religion and spirituality are a significant part of many people's lives. According to Pew Research, at least the latest findings I could find, about 2/3 or more of the US population have a belief in God, view religion as important in their lives, and attend religious services, pray, and/or meditate on a regular or semi-regular basis. And while this percentage has come down over time in recent years, it still remains relatively high. Additionally, among people with medical conditions, a very high percentage, 90%, report using religious coping in relation to their condition, with more than 40% of those indicating that religion was the most important factor keeping them going. So there's a wealth of research that really suggests that for the general population and for people with medical conditions, that religion and spirituality serves as a great support to them. So this webinar today, though, is focused on people living with psychiatric conditions and particularly recovering from psychiatric conditions. So I wondered what you thought about what these percentages look like among people living with psychiatric conditions. So I'm gonna just put up one more poll. Let's see here. And ask you, do you think that people with psychiatric conditions look similar in terms of their endorsement of religion and spirituality as the general population, less than, about the same as, or more than the general population? So again, I'm just gonna hang in for a second so people can respond. So it looks like we've got the majority saying about the same. Next is, so about 50% saying about the same as the general population, 37% more than the general population, and 13% saying less than the general population. Drum roll. So yes, individuals with psychiatric conditions do have about the same or more, depending on the statistics we look at, endorsement around religion and spirituality and the use of religion and spirituality to cope with the symptoms of mental illness. So in various studies, across various studies, a majority of people living with mental illnesses indicated that religion and spirituality are important to them. Approximately 90% of people say religion plays an important role in their lives. 80% or more utilize spirituality and religion to cope with those symptoms. And people reported spending as much as 1/2 of their total coping time in religious practices, including things like prayer. Interestingly, even among young adults who, generally speaking, are less religiously affiliated, 62% in one study, 62% mentioned religion and spirituality in the context of their mental illness with little to no prompting. So even without being directly asked about it, they identified that religion and spirituality was an important component in their lives. So who's using religious and spiritual coping strategies? In a study of individuals living, this study was with individuals living with psychotic conditions, 53% indicated that they had a moderate or greater belief in God. 21% of them said religion was moderately or very important in their life, and 15% said that they had weekly or greater attendance at public religious services. And lastly, 17% said they engaged in daily or more frequent private prayer or other religious practices. Additionally, 85% reported that they use at least some religious coping strategies. So I thought this was particularly interesting because you've got 53% of people who are reporting a moderate or greater belief in God, and 85% of people saying they use at least some religious coping strategies. So what does that 85% tell us? What I think it tells us is that people don't have to identify as religious or even have a belief in God or in order to use religious coping strategies. These strategies aren't limited just to people who identify as religious. And I think this is particularly important for us to keep in mind as we think about providing supports to people in our services and how we approach whether or not to inquire about religious or spiritual affiliation and strategies. So in terms of the role that religion and spirituality can play in recovery, we can ask why individuals with psychiatric conditions might engage in spiritual and religious activities and practices and how these might relate to their recovery. We've already mentioned that for some people, religion and spirituality can offer positive coping support. Spiritual practices can do this, including specific religious and spiritual practices, like we mentioned, prayer, meditation, mindfulness, attending a place of worship or a quiet space, or reading religious or spiritual texts. Additionally, having a spiritual relationship with God or a higher power is also an important aspect of coping with this relationship, providing a sense of comfort, reassurance, protection, guidance, and strength. Religion and spirituality can also provide a framework for making sense of one's experience of mental illness, providing some of that meaning making. People may be able to interpret or understand unusual experiences they may have related to some of their symptoms through the lens of religion and spirituality, potentially making it feel less threatening or overwhelming. Additionally, they offer a community of support, both human and divine support, to help reduce isolation and loneliness. Many people provide opportunities within religious and spiritual communities for value-driven, rewarding role and activities in which the individual is seen and valued beyond the confines of their mental health condition to what they're able to offer and bring in terms of their gifts and their relationships. Religious and spiritual acts may also impart a sense of control and meaning by providing a perspective beyond oneself and a sense of control over things that they may otherwise feel out of control around. People also report that religious beliefs help to keep them going. And in a systematic review, a qualitative systematic review of many of the studies on religion and spirituality and mental health, it was also highlighted that their religious and spiritual beliefs also include keeping them alive from the perspective of reducing their likelihood to hurt themselves or die by suicide. So all of this suggests that for some people, religion and spirituality really help to aid in moving them forward in their recovery process. This is an interesting, something that I found particularly interesting in what exists in the literature. Clients and providers have different views on how spirituality and religion can be helpful. So clients reported regarding spirituality as a source of giving and receiving love and care. So a mutuality of relationship there in which they both have an active role in providing love, support, care to others, and also in receiving, similarly, that love, support, and care from the community. Alternatively, providers, professionals, regarded connection with religion and spirituality as a means of receiving support and managing symptoms. And so while I just mentioned in the previous slide that religion and spirituality can provide support and may help some people with coping around their symptoms, I thought it was sort of notable the difference here, that the view from individuals with a lived experience of mental illness was really around that mutual relationship, the giving and receiving, the action-oriented relationship within the community. But that providers were viewing it more as the person being in a recipient role, that their activities in religious and spiritual communities and other practices would be a way of receiving support. So I just think it's important to highlight here that it's important for us as providers to try to assess and keep in mind the reciprocal nature of what, at least in this particular study, what individuals with lived experience shared as the benefit of participating in these communities. So I think it's important for me to also acknowledge in this discussion that some people have concerns and have had negative experiences and even traumas related to religion and spirituality. I think it's important for us to name these things and consider strategies to address them. So for example, some people experience spiritual struggles with the divine as it relates to their life experiences or their mental health conditions. They may feel anger towards God and feel that they're being punished by God, that the mental health condition itself is a punishment for something they've done wrong or for not being faithful enough. They may interpret their experience with the mental health condition and their challenges around it as feeling abandoned by God. And these are all understandable reactions and things that we need to acknowledge. Sometimes these same individuals who are experiencing this struggle are the same people for whom they really desire a relationship and a connection. So I think we again just need to keep in mind that just because there is a challenge or someone may feel some of these feelings, anger, abandonment, punishment, it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to reject that connection. It may be something that they want to process and work through. Or they may not. They may want to move away from it. So, and that's acceptable as well. Sometimes religious and spiritual communities, and this can also extend sometimes to family members or other supporters. Sometimes their view is that mental health conditions are moral or spiritual failures. For example, people have talked about receiving the message that if they only prayed more, or if they only believed more fully, more committedly, that that they wouldn't experience the mental health condition, and this can be a negative experience for people. It can be traumatizing for people. So in a little bit here, when Dr. Salzer speaks, I think he may touch on the importance of educating the spiritual communities as well, so that they can be welcoming to individuals who have mental health conditions, so that some of these messages might be able to be adapted. Negative experiences with religious services or communities in which people have felt rejected or stigmatized or discriminated against also happen. Sometimes this can look like gossip, or it can look like lack of inclusion, but it can also go beyond that to look at rejection and look like rejection and discrimination in the form of religious and spiritual groups' responses to certain communities, including the LGBTQ+ community, some racial and ethnic communities, and others. So it's important to, again, recognize that for some people, that's their experience with religion and spirituality. And lastly, of course, there are the traumas that have incurred through actions by religious leaders or advocates, including spiritual, emotional, and sexual abuse that have to be acknowledged and worked with. Another point that I think is important to address in the discussion is that sometimes mental health providers have concerns regarding incorporating religion and spirituality into mental health services. They may be concerned about a potential link between psychiatric symptoms and religion or spirituality. So I just want to be clear that the research has failed to support a relationship between psychopathology and religion. Specifically, some research with people with psychosis in an analysis, systematic review of studies on individuals with psychosis across 10 studies that they looked at. 4 of those studies found less psychosis among people who were more religiously involved. 3 studies found no association at all, and 2 studies found some mixed results, but within that, they didn't necessarily find a causal relationship there. So often people are particularly concerned about individuals who are experiencing psychosis and the connection between religion and spirituality and psychosis. So I think that's particularly important to highlight. There is some research that suggests that people with religious delusions may experience more severe illness, but it doesn't assess the link between religion and spirituality beliefs and or practice and those delusions, or the severity of those delusions. So some research suggests that religious activities not associated with symptoms among people with psychosis may actually improve long-term prognosis. So there's some some evidence to suggest that, again, that religion, those religious and spiritual practices may be effective at coping with some of those symptoms. In considering the connection between an individual's symptoms and their religious or spiritual beliefs, it can also be helpful to recognize that what might look like a religious, I'm going to say problem in quotes here, may just be the language or lens through which a particular symptom is being conveyed. So what I mean by that is, if someone has a religious delusion and they're a religious and spiritual person, their religious beliefs are not likely to have been the cause of that delusion. They likely would have experienced that delusion regardless, but the content of that delusion might have been different if they weren't religious or spiritual. Similarly, some people have concerns around obsessive-compulsive disorder with scrupulosity, which is a type of OCD that has religious and moral obsessions and related compulsions. Again, the obsessions aren't caused by the person being religious, but the specific content of those obsessions may be related to that. If they hadn't been religious or spiritual, it's likely that the content of the obsessions would just be different content, but they would still experience those obsessions and compulsions. So I just want to point all of that out to say that there really isn't evidence that religion and spirituality exacerbates symptoms or contributes to the exacerbation of symptoms. Rather, it may just provide the specific content of those symptoms or the association of those symptoms. So we have identified that religion and spirituality can be helpful for many people living with mental health conditions to cope with their experiences, to find meaning in their lives, to connect with communities that are supportive and establish reciprocal relationships within those relationships. We've also identified some concerns that clinicians sometimes have around pursuing discussions about spirituality and religion with people that they're working with. I'm catching myself here. I'm saying clinicians, but I'm meaning that to be a very broad term to include anyone who's working to support someone with mental health conditions, so including peers and others. But what we also know is that many people with serious mental illnesses would like religion and spirituality incorporated into their mental health services and supports. 58% expressed interest in including spirituality in their mental health services. And while religious affiliation and general spirituality and religion was associated with this effort, with this interest, over a third of people who expressed interest in having spirituality and religion incorporated into their services have no religious affiliation. So this interest goes beyond just those who identify with a specific religious affiliation. This being said, many find that clinicians, providers, peers ignore, dismiss, or otherwise pathologize this interest. And this disconnect leads to what's been termed in the literature a spirituality gap, or a failure on the part of mental health services to include or address spirituality and religion with service participants who are interested. And there are several reasons for this spirituality gap, including that there's little professional development and training around how to integrate religion and spirituality and mental health services. Without training, many mental health practitioners lack the ability, the comfort, the efficacy to engage in spiritually competent care frequently. mental health providers as a whole have tended to ignore or undervalue the role of clients' spirituality and religion in treatment. That comes from a study that's a little older, and so that may be improving somewhat. But what the research also tells us is the strongest predictor of whether a practitioner, a clinician, a peer, a supporter, integrates clients' spirituality and religion into services and supports. The biggest predictor of that is their own spirituality and religious views and behavior. And mental health providers as a whole, in general, tend to be less religious than the general population. And we saw before that people with mental health conditions are similarly, if not more, religious and spiritual. So we have a group of individuals within mental health clinicians who are less spiritual on average as a whole than the people that they're providing services and supports to. So there's a mismatch there, potentially. I've also heard from clinicians, I did a presentation on this not too long ago, and some of the folks in the room said, I'm happy to talk about religion and spirituality, but I want to wait until the individual that I'm working with brings it up, because I don't want to seem like I'm imposing my values. Unfortunately, what the research shows on this is that individuals would prefer that the practitioner initiate that discussion. Individuals may not bring it up because they're concerned that it may be a taboo subject. And of course, we know that often, because of the dynamic of these kinds of relationships with mental health professionals, sometimes there is a power differential. And so the individual engaged in services may not feel comfortable doing that. And so it may be important for the clinician, the supporter, to raise this with the individual to assess whether it's something that they want incorporated into their services and supports. And in fact, many organizations are beginning to integrate into their intake assessments questions around spirituality and religion, so that they have a better sense of this and the individual's needs and desires as they come into the program. So there are many reasons to work towards addressing the spirituality gap, including those that I've covered, as well as our ethical obligations to provide person-centered care and to address the things that are most supportive of the individual and what might help move them forward in their recovery. So how do we know how to do that? I just kind of reviewed, most of us haven't received training on that. We might feel uncomfortable. We may not know what to say. And so there are a few different strategies. I do see here, just I'm glancing at the chat, that someone's brought up Samsa's 8 Dimensions of Wellness, which covers spirituality. And I do have a slide. Oh, I might have taken it out of this actually. But certainly one of the strategies is to utilize a holistic approach to working with somebody and having them identify their strengths, their areas of need, and their areas of support in all of the 8 dimensions. And by doing that, you include spirituality in that, but don't focus exclusively on spirituality. And that may be more comfortable for some people. In order to provide some additional concrete, actionable steps that providers and faith communities as well can take to work to bridge this gap, I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Mark Salser, and he's going to share with us some of the work that he and his center have been doing.
Great. Thank you, Anne. And I'm also not sure I'm able to forward the slides, so I might have to ask you to do that. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for your great overview of everything. And I'll just let everybody know that whenever Dr. Murphy wants to do anything that involves me, I'm always happy to do it. She's been a terrific colleague for a long time. I also want to welcome everybody to this webinar. I've been following the chat pretty closely and love the kind of comments and dialogue that are happening there. I would like to encourage you to make sure in the To button that you send your messages to all panelists and attendees, so the comments don't just go to the panelists unless you want them to just go to the panelists. So it's a little Zoom thing that we all need to get to know. So it's great to be with everybody today. I direct a center that we call the Temple University Collaborative on Community Inclusion, and I didn't include the rest of individuals with serious mental illnesses, significant mental illnesses. We're funded by NIDLR, which is the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, and we have a very similar disclaimer. While we're federally funded, the contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration on Community Living, NIDLR, and we shouldn't assume endorsement by the federal government. The work that we do in our center is around inclusion, trying to raise awareness about what inclusion is, what it means, what the current state of inclusion is for people with significant mental health issues, and interventions for promoting inclusion. Our focus on inclusion really takes both a legal and a human rights orientation. The legal orientation is based on the Americans with Disabilities Act, that gives individuals who experience disabilities the right to the opportunity to basically live in the community like everyone else. That means work, going to school, parenting, leisure recreation, and in some cases, faith as well. It's also a human right based on the Declaration on Human Rights signed by the United Nations in 2006 that also talked about inclusion, and the opportunity to live in the community like everyone else is a human right for all people who experience disabilities, and that includes people who experience significant mental health issues. So that's really the orientation that I take with this kind of work. And what I'll be talking about in the next maybe 25 or 30 minutes or so are some of the strategies that we pulled together for promoting inclusion of individuals in faith community, not necessarily just for their mental health benefit, even though we do talk about that, but mostly from the rights perspective, that people should have the opportunity to do things just like everyone else. Next slide, Anne. Great, thank you. So one reference I'd like to point you to, we created a document a few years ago called Well Together. This document really lays out a number of things that I'll be talking about the importance of inclusion and different strategies or fundamentals for promoting inclusion of people with lived experience of mental health issues. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's got a lot of information in there. You can basically Google Well Together and my last name, Salzer. That's one way to get it. If you have trouble, go ahead and send me an email and I'll be happy to send it your way. One of the things that we focus on in regards to inclusion and participation in faith communities is the need to expand the paradigm a little bit in how these conversations are happening, especially within faith communities. One thing where there's a lot of conversation happening right now is faith communities serving or supporting the mental health needs of their congregants. And this is particularly important these days, where depression, anxiety, suicide, substance use is a major issue that's happening right now. And faith communities are actively involved in those conversations. And I'd really encourage you to check out the Partnership Center, which is part of Health and Human Services in the federal government. They've got a lot of resources in this area. The work that our center does is we talk about not necessarily how faith communities can actively get people mental health services, but instead what faith communities and what provider community can do to support people in being engaged in faith communities to the extent that they'd like to participate in the faith community. So it's really expanding the paradigm a little bit from faith communities referring people to mental health services instead to faith communities being available and welcoming and embracing of people who experience mental health issues for some of the reasons that Anne mentioned in her presentation, that they have not always been welcoming and embracing. Next slide, Anne. So we've developed a couple of documents that you might be interested in looking at. And again, we will be sending out the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to see, look at this not so user-friendly web link, but you can also find this on our website as well. One of our documents is about how to develop welcoming faith communities, and especially the role that providers can take in promoting engagement in faith communities. Next slide. And here are 5 of the things that we talk about that strategies can do for promoting inclusion. We don't mean for this to be viewed as an exhaustive list. There are a lot of things that mental health providers are doing currently to support people being engaged in faith communities, but these are just some of the more common ones that we've been coming across in our conversations with people. The first one, from a very basic standpoint, is for the provider community and the faith communities to develop formal relationships or formal connections. That means programs or agencies reaching out to faith communities to establish a dialogue and talk about how they can support one another in supporting people who are in their congregations currently or who might feel excluded from their congregations in being included and welcomed and embraced like other congregants. It's also supporting faith communities in reaching out to the behavioral health system as well. Related to that is point number 2, and that's really promoting or encouraging outreach and inreach. The outreach is the behavioral health system and behavioral health providers reaching out to faith communities to see what resources are available, what opportunities are there for individuals to participate in their communities, and also provide opportunities for faith communities to be engaged in behavioral health programs and in agencies. And I must say, I have seen some of the chat messages that people have written. I'm not sure if they went out to all panelists and attendees, but some people have clearly heard the message from supervisors and from other people in their organizations that we can't do these kinds of things, that it's illegal or it's forbidden based on Medicaid funding or those kinds of things. And it's actually not completely accurate. We certainly can't proselytize, but we can support engagement and interaction between faith communities and the behavioral health community. So I think it's important for all of us to learn more about this relationship and really question these messages that we might be hearing from people who might not know enough about this topic. I'm not going to go into that in a lot more detail. That's probably a whole separate webinar by itself, but it's, I would challenge that for those who are hearing those messages. The third thing that providers can do, and I'm sure a lot of you who are part of this webinar today do this already, is to really follow up on questions. We often ask people in intake whether or not they're a person of faith, what their faith might be, and then we leave that in a document somewhere and really don't follow up with people about that. And the issue is we do need to follow up on that and ask people if they want support in being engaged in their faith communities and support their engagement. If somebody has a goal of attending a community a certain day during the week, we can help them with calendar reminders, help them figure out how to get there. So transportation is a major issue that limits people's participation in faith communities. And these are the kinds of things that we can do to support individuals. Number 4 is supporting that participation, especially with natural supporters. unpaid people who might be available to go with them to participate in their faith. A lot of times when I've talked to individuals who have not been as engaged in their faith, they've said that they have nobody to go with, they don't know anybody, they're embarrassed, they're concerned about not being fully welcomed, and establishing those natural supports, somebody to go with them, somebody who might encourage them to attend with them. This might be somebody from that particular congregation, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but really looking for those natural supporters who can help somebody be engaged. The last thing that I'll mention that providers can do, and it's really more related to developing those formal connections as well, is just find out what resources are available, what faith resources are available in your community. Again, get to know the congregations, get to know the leadership. It's really important for behavioral health providers to be connected to the larger faith community. There are lots of resources there, lots of opportunities for connection. And I would say the faith community is most people are very interested in establishing these relationships. Next slide, Anne. We've developed another document about the role that peers can play, peer specialists can play in supporting faith. And based on the poll that Anne did earlier, it looks like we've got a number of people with lived experience and peer support roles who are a part of the webinar. It's great to see you today. And some folks have been chatting about where they're from and their background as well. So this document really describes some of the things that peers are talking about in terms of supporting faith. This is an area that I've become increasingly interested in because spirituality is for many people an aspect of their recovery. It really makes sense for spirituality to be part of the work that peers are engaged with, because that's part of recovery for many individuals. And this is really one unique area where peers can play a particularly vital role in promoting engagement in faith and spirituality for individuals. Next slide, Anne. Some of the things we heard from some conversations we were having with peer specialists is, again, many people, many peers reported that faith was important to their recovery. Faith was critical to their recovery. And in terms of giving back to their peers, the opportunity to talk about their faith, not necessarily proselytize, but the opportunity to talk about it was expressed by many people we talked about. But the second finding that we heard from peer specialists is that they often received messages from others, especially their supervisors, that it might be safer or more prudent or legal to not talk about these kinds of things and not have these types of conversations. And again, I think that these are some of the things that I've seen on some of the chat messages that people have been writing. People are being told that they're concerned about the possibility of having competing religious or spiritual beliefs and how that might be divisive. And of course, with some training and understanding about how to promote religion and spirituality or engagement in faith, certainly being able to talk about differences is the approach that is most recommended, and not allow it to be a divisive interaction. Sometimes, and I think Anne mentioned this, there's concern about promoting unhealthy religious ideation. Faith may violate some funding rules. And again, I think that was mentioned in some of the chat. And again, as Anne mentioned, some peer specialists may have already or also had their own negative experiences with faith and faith communities, and they might be uncomfortable talking about this with peers that they're supporting. Next slide, Anne. Oops, I don't see the, oh, there we go, thank you. Some of the recommendations in these conversations that we've had with peer specialists, and again, I'm doing some more research with some colleagues in this area. Actually, right now, I just had a meeting this morning about this. Here's some recommendations that we heard from people. The first recommendation is to certainly talk with your supervisor within your program and agency about the role that you can play in supporting people's connection to religious or spiritual organizations, to really make the point, as Anne pointed out, that faith is important for many people with lived experience, and this is not a pathological issue for most. And it's really important for peers to be able to talk to their providers, to their supervisors about how they can support people's engagement in faith. Certainly talking with the people they're supporting about their goals, raising the issue about possibly reconnecting or connecting with religious or spiritual communities. Is this something they want to pursue? Yes or no? If not, certainly leave it. And if this is something somebody wants to pursue, then to take steps to support it as well. We also talk about the peers establishing relationship with communities of faith as well, and discussing how, with faith communities, how they can be more welcoming and embracing of people who experience mental health issues into their congregations, possibly giving talks to faith communities about what faith and spirituality has meant to them in order to help those congregations become more welcoming and embracing as well. Looking for opportunities for people to connect to faith communities beyond attendance at services or religious events is also another role that peer specialists can play. And then overall, just working with your agency or program to talk about religion and spirituality, probably even more than they do now, could be a potential role that peer specialists could play as well. That's somewhat of an advocacy role within programs and agencies. Peers, possibly more than other non-peer providers, understand the importance of faith in recovery, and it might be an important role for them to serve as advocates as well within their organizations. Next slide. So a lot of work that our center has been doing has actually not been within the provider community or with peers. We've been doing a lot of work with clergy and faith communities themselves in order to promote inclusion of individuals with mental health issues. The reason for this is we take what's called a social model of disability perspective, where we've identified that while there are a lot of people who experience mental health issues who are interested in being engaged in faith communities, that the faith communities are not always welcoming and embracing, and that this might be one of the reasons why people are not as involved or as engaged as they would like to be. Prejudice and discrimination is probably as strong in faith communities as it is in the general population. And I will say it's very powerful in the general population as well. And it's something we need to address. Next slide. So there have been a number of activities that have gone on over the last decade or so about promoting inclusion of all individuals who experience disabilities in faith communities. This has been an area that faith communities have been interested in for a little while, how to support people who experience physical impairment, sensory impairment, hearing impairment, visual impairment, cognitive impairment, and more recently, autism as well, people who experience developmental disabilities. So there's been a lot of interest, and there's been a lot of work about how to promote inclusion of individuals with differences in faith communities. So some of the strategies, and you see the references here, and again, you'll be able to, you'll get the PowerPoint and be able to access some of these resources, but there's been a lot of conversation and discussion about addressing the attitudinal barriers. This basically is prejudice and discrimination about people who experience disabilities. There are some congregations that are that have historically been concerned about people with physical disabilities participating in their services or in their congregation, or sensory disabilities. And obviously there's a lot of concern still about people with psychiatric disabilities as well. Actually, could you go back one slide, Anne? There's also programmatic barriers that have been addressed. And there's also some great information that we've been sharing with faith leaders from a great study that was done and published in 2012, that it's really important to have faith leaders who are committed to inclusion, and this is inclusion broadly speaking, that are involved in educational activities for their congregations and themselves around inclusion of everyone who experiences disabilities. People with disabilities or impairments need to be discussed in positive ways, and this has not always been the case historically in some faith communities. Having faith communities that had strong ties with disability organizations, and I would say with behavioral organizations as well, have tended to be more inclusive of people who experience those issues, and faith communities that have a stronger orientation toward promoting social justice have also been more inclusive as well. And I didn't say this at the beginning of my part of this webinar, but inclusion is a social justice issue. This is an issue related to oppression that people have experienced, and it's something that we need to be addressing through laws and paying attention to human rights, but also our practices and efforts to ensure that people have the opportunity to participate in the community like everyone else. Next slide. So there are some other steps that congregations can take, learn more about the importance of inclusion as an aspect of celebrating diversity, broadly speaking, in congregations. That's one strategy that people have taken, addressing prejudice and discrimination that they have, learning more about groups that have traditionally been marginalized, including being marginalized in faith communities, is important to address negative attitudes and beliefs people might have, really reaching out to marginalized populations, including the disability population, and people with mental health issues is also important. And again, having an orientation that is more welcoming and accommodating and embracing difference, rather than seeing difference or impairments as a hassle, as something you don't want to have to deal with, as something ugly that you don't want to see when you're in a particular service or other type of activity. Next slide. So some general sample examples that faith communities have been involved with. And again, I'm talking here about promoting inclusion of all people who experience disabilities, including people with mental health issues. But it's really important for congregations to make it known that they're welcoming and embracing to people who experience differences, and to make it known that they're an inclusive community for all people. Again, many people, including those with lived experience of mental health issues, have not had good experiences in faith communities. And so for some of them, they might be interested in coming back, but they are unsure or unwilling to be heard again. So it's really important for congregational messages on websites, on newsletters, to say we welcome, we're inclusive of all people, and to specifically mention that they're inclusive of people who experience disabilities as well. Religious leaders making frequent statements about inclusion that's linked to theology is incredibly important as well. To talk about disability and impairment as part of theology is critically important. For lay leadership to also be involved in promoting inclusion as a priority, to develop work groups around these issues is incredibly important. This is something that our center's been actively involved with in helping different faith communities, and I mentioned synagogues here, but help them establish these work groups to talk through how they can become a more welcoming and embracing environment. And then really encouraging frequent conversations among congregants about inclusion, and including fears of inclusion. And one of those fears is fears of violence, especially people with lived experience. Next slide, Anne. This is just an example of the type of messaging that's really important for people to to have out there, really welcoming those people who may have been unwelcomed in the past in faith communities. But this particular welcome message also includes messages about welcoming people who experience disabilities as well. Next slide. And then another strategy, again, general strategy the faith communities can take as well. This was a campaign around creating accessible congregations. It's called the Accessible Congregation Campaign. And basically the idea was to really publicize in all messaging why the particular congregation is welcoming and embracing of people with disabilities, and talking about this from a liturgical standpoint or a theological standpoint, as well as a rights and social justice standpoint as well. So you can check out this resource. I think it's easily available on the internet. Next slide. So I mentioned before that one of the major barriers that we're hearing and that many of you may have experienced as you've interacted with faith communities is, unfortunately, just like the general population, leadership, faith leadership, and congregants seem to have similar attitudes and beliefs. This is my anecdotal observations as the general population about people with lived experience, people with mental health issues. And this is concerning. I've heard of faith communities talking about their need to do things to protect their children from people with mental health issues, which is always disconcerting when I hear these kinds of things. So obviously it's important for us as a behavioral health community to reach out to the faith community and share the information, not just in May. May is Mental Health Month, not just in October, but all the time. Because unfortunately, what we're doing right now is not having enough of an impact, and share the information about prejudice and discrimination and really counter some of the myths that people have. Talk about the fact that people are, in general, no more violent than the general population. That's critically important. People with lived experience are no more likely to be involved in gun violence than the general population. And in fact, the connection between mental health and violence is that people with lived experience are much more likely to be the victims of violence and abuse than the general population. And people experience what a colleague and I call verbal violence. They're threatened, they're called names, horrible things people are hearing. So it's really important for us to continue to get the message out to the broader faith community so they can become more welcoming and embracing. But one-shot trainings, one-shot presentations is probably not going to do it. It's going to take long-term conversations, communications, supporting clergy and talking about these things. It's going to take a lot of effort to address these things. Next slide. So some specific strategies that are being used in faith communities to become more welcoming and embracing. There is a big movement around mental health first aid training, and I think Samsa has been a supporter of this in the past, to support congregations in becoming more comfortable with mental health issues, talking about mental health issues, and responding if somebody might be in distress related to mental health issues. This is often one of the basic first requests that faith communities ask for, and we certainly think that this is important. It's a way of starting the conversation. I'm somewhat uncomfortable with keeping the conversation about symptoms and impairment, and really want to talk about the benefits to the congregation about inclusion of people who experience mental health issues in congregations, or including them even more because they're already present. But mental health first aid is certainly one approach. I mentioned different strategies for addressing prejudice and discrimination, having conversations, having speakers bureaus. Denver, actually, with their mental health system in the city of Denver, they have a great dialogue and conversations between mental health community and the faith community where they're really trying to address these kinds of things. Supporting faith congregations and being engaged with consumer and family advocacy organizations is critically important. That outreach and conversation is important. And again, connections with the mental health systems and agencies, and really doing some work to understand that not only does this issue affect the person themselves with lived experience, but that the exclusion of people with mental health issues also leaves many family members feeling excluded as well. I've talked to many family members who say that they do not go to their congregation anymore because they don't feel welcomed, because their loved one is not welcomed. And it's really important for us to also think about this from a family perspective as well. Next slide. So I just have a couple more slides, and then we're going to open it up both to the Q&A and in the chat as well for your questions and comments. And there's, again, some good stuff going on in the chat. I wanted to just specifically mention some other strategies that can be taken to especially promote these natural supports to support participation in faith community. And again, most of this is based on conversations we've had with people where they feel like they don't know anybody in the congregation, they're worried about how they'll be treated. And congregations actually have developed what they call befrienders ministries. This is one example of developing natural supports within the faith community to really welcome all new members to that community. So really encouraging congregations to maybe take this approach, and they'll serve as a resource and a support for people with lived experience who might come to the congregation. Again, it doesn't require disclosure of having a mental health issue as well. We are not big supporters of that, but creating just a typical befrienders ministry for anyone coming to the congregation so they feel welcomed and embraced. So next slide. Some other strategies that we also promote within the faith community, but also outside as well, is to pursue some other types of programs or initiatives for developing natural supports. And again, natural supports are unpaid people. They could be family members, neighbors, congregants in a particular congregation. They could be distant cousins. They could be anybody. And really developing strategies to connect individuals with these natural supporters. And here are a couple different strategies. I'll talk about the Compier program as one example. Compier is a program that started many years ago in Rochester, New York. It basically connects people, an individual with lived experience with another individual from the community, and they get to know each other and develop a relationship. It's not a mentoring program. It's not the natural supporter, the community person helping the individual with mental health issues. They support one another. And we've been promoting this type of Compier-like initiative within faith communities where they can support a congregant, a member of a particular congregation who's available to be a supporter of anybody. It could be a person with lived experience or really anybody, and help them feel more comfortable and welcomed in that particular congregation. So these are some strategies you might want to take a look at. Next slide. And obviously I mentioned some of the befrienders ministry. There's also an approach called family helpers. So this is really moving from that Compier model, which is a one-to-one model, to more of a model where families in a congregation are supporting one another in engagement in the faith community. So this is another type of approach that could be used as well. Circles of support is where a group of individuals agree to support somebody who'd like to be more active in a faith community. It's run by the person with lived experience. They choose who's in their circle. They choose what the goal of the circle is. So I want to go to church, synagogue, or mosque more often. And the members of the circle agree to support that individual in engaging in that activity as much as they would like. So one person might be available to, I'll give you a ride. The other person might, call them up to remind them that there's something going on that they might want to attend that day. Each person takes a different role to support that individual in achieving the goal that they've identified. Behavioral contracting is the idea that some individuals have experienced some challenges during services where they've engaged in behaviors that the rest of the congregation and the leadership of that faith community find distracting or not conducive to the service or the activity that they're involved with. And this is a strategy that we've encouraged faith communities to use. Instead of just kicking that person out and saying you can no longer come back, having a conversation with the person to talk about what's happened and how they can develop a plan for how to deal with this situation if it happens in the future. So that's what behavioral contracting is about, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. Next slide. And I think this might be my last slide, but these are, oh, it's not my last slide. These are just some additional conversations that, a particular faith community in Lancaster, Pennsylvania has been talking about, again, mostly having conversations about being welcoming and embracing of people with lived experience, how to overcome resistance that people may have. They've talked about making their services available online. And this is interesting given the recent COVID experience that we're all going through. For a long time, or we know that many people aren't participating because transportation's an issue, or they're having, it's hard to get out of bed to make it to a service in the morning or in the evening. And we've really been encouraging congregations to make services available online to increase access to many people, including those people who may have challenges because of mental health issues. And for a long time, we heard that this was not possible, that this would undermine their mission and what they're about, or even their spirituality. But thankfully, almost every congregation I know has gone online during this pandemic and found that it's not completely horrible. And I hope that most keep it going. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through these very briefly. I mentioned that creating alternative settings, using video cameras or other ways for people to participate as being one strategy for promoting inclusion. If there's a challenge during the middle of a service or an event, if that service or event was online or made available, the person could watch it out in the lobby or in another room or something like that. Somebody said correction to therapeutic. I'll have to look at that. There's also a Beit Midrash in Jerusalem. This is a place where more Orthodox Jews in this case study Torah, which is one of the most important things in the Jewish religion to do. And what's happened, because many individuals were not welcomed in, individuals with lived experience were not welcomed in typical Beit Midrashes, they developed a Beit Midrash that was welcoming for anyone, including individuals with mental health issues, with different behaviors and ways of thinking and communicating. So this was one way of creating a welcoming environment where they were unwelcome in other environments. And then the last slide. And these are just some other strategies that congregations are using. So one is there's a congregation in Tulsa, Oklahoma that's developed a bakery that involves people with lived experience and congregational members, and they work together in this business. And also in Tulsa, there was a consortium of faith communities that was working together to address homelessness, especially for people with lived experience as well. So I did notice that there were a number of people, there were only a few people, I think, who were clergy. And so I hope that some of this information is of interest. For those who aren't, for the peer specialists and the other non-peer professionals who are on this webinar, I hope that some of these ideas might be useful to you as you start having more of a dialogue with faith communities and explore ideas for how you can support them or how they can support individuals with mental health issues to be more involved. So thank you for your time, and I've left a little bit of time for us to have a conversation.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was really great. And we have about 15 minutes or so. If people have questions, I see there's been quite a robust discussion in the chat, which I'm thrilled about. I think some of what's been there is painful things. And so I'm glad that people are having the opportunity to voice those and to also acknowledge that that hasn't necessarily led them to not want to be a part of faith communities, but to work to improve those relationships and those connections. And I also appreciate the support you're offering to each other. I saw, as Mark had seen, quite a few comments about not being allowed to provide support around spirituality and religion. And so, and while I don't know all of the billing regulations and all of those sorts of things, I think with most of these things, there are ways to do them. It's a matter of what you call it and how you frame it. And so I would encourage people to continue to think and speak with their leadership about the information that Mark has shared around strategies and some of the information I've provided around the statistics about the importance of this and the benefits. Okay, so let me see, I'm looking in the Q&A. Please feel free, if you have questions, to type them in the chat box or in the Q&A. Let me see here. So there's a question, and there were a couple comments around 12-step approaches and their use in substance use treatment, although they're certainly used with other things as well. And a question about mandating 12-step participation and whether that could be harmful. I don't know if Mark has any thoughts on those, but I know that 12-step programs are helpful for many people, and they do try to utilize a broad conceptualization of a higher power so that it's not requiring faith or religious association. But I think there's a challenge with mandating anything. So that's my comment as it sort of tangentially relates to what we're talking about today. I don't know, Mark, if you have anything else you want to say about that as I look at some additional questions.
Yeah, no, I missed that in chat, but I would definitely, I would agree with that. Also, I do know that some, especially more national 12-step oriented groups have developed language around these issues that is more welcoming of people from a broad range of faiths and orientation to spirituality as well. So not all 12-step groups are the same, even if they're using the same model. You've seen one AA group, you've seen one AA group. It matters on the people, how they're interpreting things. So if that's what you're interested in and that's an approach, I am a fan of 12-step approaches, but but yeah, there's a whole range for a lot of different people.
Thank you. We had a question or a comment / question about, I mentioned that utilizing Samsa's 8 dimensions of wellness might be a strategy for discussing, introducing a discussion around spirituality. The question is, how does one more specifically bring this up? And there's a suggestion that self-care might be another way to get at a question around spirituality and faith practices as it may relate to one's self-care. So, I mean, I think there are countless ways that you can initiate a conversation about one's spirituality and religion. Mark mentioned, you know, that all too often it is included in an intake, but then that gets put on the shelf and never addressed again. And so I think almost more importantly than how to initiate a conversation about it is how to maintain a conversation about it, again, if the person's interested. So I think trying to look at ways to incorporate faith and spirituality in one's, you know, in one's overall interests and goals. Mark talked a lot about different ways to help people engage in their community and actively participate in that community. And those are often pieces that are connected to what someone's goals might be, whether their goal is to, you know, to work or to be in a relationship or to buy a house, you know, whatever it might be. Connecting with those broader communities and being actively engaged in their community, with spirituality and religion being one of those, I think is a way to have it really come to life, not just through kind of naming it in an assessment and identifying that someone's interested in it, but actually sort of infusing it into all the work that you're doing with someone. Mark, if you want to add, no obligation.
Nope, I thought that was great.
Okay.
Yep. I was looking at some of the Q&A topics.
Please.
Oh, yep. Thanks. So a couple of great comments and questions in Q&A as well. So Jennifer wrote, what can we do as a peer with a mental health lived experience to encourage our church to be involved and more accepting of people with mental illnesses, with mental health issues? And yeah, I mean, that's probably where a lot of people are starting. And the first thing I would say is I do want to recognize something Beth put in chat about her experience in talking about her recovery and the silence we heard. And Beth, I hear you, and I unfortunately hear this from many people. And there's a lot of discomfort out there in faith communities and outside. And I think it's very difficult and challenging. There are lots of people who are rightly concerned about disclosure even in their faith communities. I think finding allies is really important, and starting to have these types of conversations, hopefully with a committed group of individuals, is one way to do it. I know some people have worked with their clergy, and sometimes clergy also have experienced their own lived experience, and more clergy are talking about their own lived experience as well. So possibly going to leadership in your congregation and talking about, or asking about ways that the congregation can talk more about these issues and be more welcoming and embracing. But it is tough. It'll take a while. Again, the prejudice and discrimination, the perspectives are very well ingrained in the faith community as much as it is in the general population. Related to that actually is there was a question about whether there's an assessment tool one can use to get a feel about how congregants, or if you have a program to get about, I imagine, how congregants think about where they're at in terms of supporting, I imagine, being welcoming and embracing, or attitudes and beliefs about mental health issues, if I'm reading that correctly. And I do like the thought of one way of starting a conversation in a congregation is to use one of the many measures that are out there about prejudice and discrimination. related to mental health issues, and seeing if the congregation is willing to do a survey of the congregation on these issues to see where the congregation is at. And I'm a big fan of it because, unfortunately, I suspect that we'll see some things that some people might not be so happy about, but that'll be a great way to start a conversation. Or if everybody says great things, maybe it's a good way to start a conversation about what we can do then to put these attitudes and beliefs into action to really more actively support and welcome people with mental health issues. So those are two topics, Anne. I don't know if you have any thoughts on those.
No, I think that was good. I see a push in the Q&A to address a question that someone else asked. So about Medicaid, can you expound on what Medicaid allows as far as including spirituality, religion in our programs? I have to admit that I do not have expertise in that area, and so I'm reticent to offer too many suggestions. Medicaid is also varies state to state and what it will cover. There was a comment, I didn't note who made it, but someone from Illinois that was talking about they have a fairly simple structured way of including spirituality as part of self-determination and self-definition of goals and an aspect of wellness that allows it to be covered within Medicaid. I don't know, Mark, if you have any additional information about that.
So I don't have, first of all, Medicaid language, as Anne mentioned, is different in different states, but the general, the issue is, what do we mean about talking about faith and spirituality, right? So no, I've not seen any Medicaid guidelines that say you can't talk about faith and spirituality. So I would really question those of you who are hearing that. This is actually a pretty old myth that's been out there for a long, long time. But we can't proselytize. We can't say you need to do this, or if you don't find this. There are definitely issues there that's probably more of a legal liability issue rather than a Medicaid funding issue. I would encourage those of you who are running into this to do surveys, to look up information that's available online, to try to identify this language that people are mentioning or asking them what this language is. And also be very clear about how you'd want to talk about spirituality and faith. What I would say is there is a pretty strong movement in every healthcare discipline around doing a better job of including faith and spirituality in their conversations with patients, clients, consumers. So that leads me to believe that it's absolutely not the case that you can't talk about this in healthcare, because every discipline I know of has a policy or is developing something, and so take a look at it. There are experts, actually. There have been presentations, conversations about this, but I know the bottom line is it matters on what you're talking about, but in general, sure, you can talk about faith and support people's faith and spirituality. I would go even that far.
Thanks, Mark. And there's some other, we're really just about out of time. There's been something in the chat, and there's a question too about, if your client is presenting or holds different beliefs. And I think the thing to remember there is that this is really about the person you're working with and you're supporting and what's important to them. So just like we do with most things in working with other individuals, it's not about our personal belief systems, our values. It's about their beliefs, their values, what's important to them, their goals. And I think as long as we stay grounded in that and make sure to focus on them, we reduce conflict, a concern around any conflict, because we're with them, we're walking with them. And supporting them, and it's not really about us. So I think trying to approach it, quite simply as a person-centered approach will help you to stay focused on what's important to the individual. We are just at the end of our time here. So thank you all for the active participation, the very many interesting and helpful questions, and the support and conversation that you all have had with each other. It's been wonderful to get to just see it out of the corner of my eye as it speeds by. As was mentioned at the beginning, we do ask that you complete a survey. You'll receive a link to the survey in your email, so you don't have to worry about the QR code here, but it's there if you'd like to use it. And in the slides, you'll receive our contact information as well as all of the references. And we'll also send out to you links to the tools that Mark was referring to in his slides, so you have easy access to them on his site. So I want to thank Dr. Sulzer again for his willingness to participate in this. I really appreciate both his participation and all of the incredible work that he and his center do, not only around inclusion around spirituality and religion, but all of the inclusion and participation work that you've done over the years. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's attended and participated. Be well, and thank you again.